Hello, everyone. I'm sorry for all the technical challenges that we were having earlier. Thank you for bearing with us. There's still people outside milling about looking at posters, and so what I'd like to talk about here now is what the context for those posters are. So today we're talking about advancing equity and access in mobility and transportation. And this is sponsored by the Tasker Center for Accessible Technology, Designing for the Fullness of Human Experience. What we try to do at the center is essentially develop, translate, and deploy technologies that increase independence and improve quality of life for everyone. And we center the experience of people with disabilities. So later on today, we'll discuss AccessMap.app, which is our new multimodal trip planner, where one can designate different mobility limitations and needs and wants about how one navigates in the pedestrian environment. And what we're going to urge you to do is join our trial and try these tools, and there will be a raffle today for some of the folks that will be entering. And so you can go to tinyurl.com, go AccessMap to sign up for the trial. But talking today, and very soon we'll have our town hall meeting here and panel discussion. Access is really personal. It's been a little bit imposed upon us that a lot of the tooling about access and mobility and transportation, because of the lack of data or the lack of prior ability to be really able to address personal mobility, a lot of the tools have ignored the heterogeneity across different populations. And so what we try to do here is really ameliorate some of that. We're looking at data that really captures the personal experience of navigating different travel environments. You can see in a lot of our work, we capture data about the public right-of-way and sidewalk infrastructure. We capture data about indoor transportation pathways, as well as different types of services that are not necessarily captured by the general scheduled bus and transit system, but rather is what's called on-demand transportation. These are different types of services that serve different populations with specific needs about their travel. So access is really personal, and our way of addressing that is through personal mobility profiles. We try to capture different needs, wants, and preferences, and be able to then identify how different people's mobility challenges and limitations may actually interact with environments or services. The next tenet that we promote is that access is not a binary category. We see a lot of times when people try to look at a sidewalk and, oh yeah, that's accessible or not accessible. And we try to really identify ways by which we can explain to the population at large that what's accessible to me may not be accessible to another person. And therefore, we need to really capture detailed, neutral data, objective data about sidewalk environments, about all of these paths that we're talking about. And while it's hard, nowadays we have more and more tooling that enables us to do this at scale, and that's kind of what we're trying to show you today, right? So what you saw in some of the posters outside is that we've set up a data infrastructure that allows undergraduates, high schoolers, some of the posters out there were actually done by high schoolers, who can access APIs and grab the data about the public right-of-way and be able to do these very personalized simulations of how somebody with a requirement for a curb ramp might be able to reach in the pedestrian right-of-way, or how somebody with specific limitations on mobility up a hill might be able to navigate a particular environment. So access, not a binary category, and what we try to promote through that is the collection of at-scale data that's very objective, neutral, and enables us to do these simulations with varying mobility profiles. The next tenet is that access evaluation requires a network and not just separate assets. So we find that a lot of transportation agencies or departments of transportation collect data about these different environments in very asset-based type management systems. So you might have, in the old days, an Excel spreadsheet that details the sidewalk on the right side of 34th Avenue, and it was last visited in 1994 to assess, a driveway that was just built. But it's not a connected network, and that doesn't allow us to actually perform these kinds of evaluations about how do people connect here, because that is super important and relevant to access and equity. So a detailed pedestrian transportation network, whether it's in indoor environments, outdoor environments, or how things are connected, is kind of the core of being able to do equity and accessibility work. And lastly, working with local communities is really important in all of this work because we have different access priorities in different localities, and being able to elevate that and elevate the voices of those who are experiencing those different challenges in different localities is really important. So as Doreen knows, we started our work in Seattle here in 2014, and it was really clear at that point that people wanted to elevate the concerns around grade, sidewalk grade, because Seattle is rather hilly. But also indoor environments were really important because as you travel downtown, a lot of people go in and out of public buildings in order to escalate through the building through an elevator as opposed to taking the sidewalk infrastructure. Then we went to Twin Cities, Minnesota, and they really didn't care much about elevation. At the same time, they have these skyways and an entire infrastructure that's allowing people to pass through during the cold months of the year where it's snowed out. And so local community concerns are very important to identify very early on in this kind of data collection that's objective, neutral, and at scale. All right, so what are some of the key principles? We co-design with communities, especially those with lived experiences of transportation exclusion, and we develop common capacity building tools and ecosystems to sustain that work by communities. So what you saw out there is a number of different posters, works by undergraduate and high school groups that had access to this common capacity building tool, an API that allows them to just grab data about the public right-of-way in different places, be able to play with it. And this summer, we're actually going to open that course up to community members who want to do advocacy work in the same way, because you're able to elevate and ask a lot of important questions about, how does my community support people who require curb ramps in these types of different settings? What kinds of services are not accessible given these different mobility requirements? Other questions that we've been able to ask and answer in the past, for example, is access to public transit. Who does or does not have access to public transit ends up really impacting the way a community can live, survive, access economic opportunities, access schooling, healthcare, et cetera. So by creating this common capacity building infrastructure, we're trying to support communities, not just undergrad students and high schoolers, although I think it's still pretty cool that they're doing this kind of work, to enable people to interact with the data on an ongoing basis. And one of the reasons we are really promoting this is because use of the data promotes maintenance and update. And what we often see in the collection, especially of sidewalk data, but just data around all over, is that if you're not using it, you're not managing it. So you're not managing the infrastructure, but if you're not using it, you're also not updating the data on an ongoing basis. But that said, we also need to provide people with the adequate tools and ease of use of those tools so that updates can be made pretty well and often. And so some of what we're actually working with Seattle DOT on is how to allow people who have just constructed a curb ramp to provide an authorized sort of edit to that infrastructure to say, you know, I just put this in, can you update the data sort of just in time? And then finally, we've designed and built an interoperable shared data infrastructure for those relevant transportation data in order to support those two items above. So I can go on to talk about the participatory community co-design that we've done. But I think one thing, if you haven't had a chance to talk to some of our students out there, it's a great opportunity to go out and meet them and kind of find out how easy it may have been to access the network, to access the routing applications, allowing them to really delve into the data and the details of where people might reach, as opposed to having to do a lot of work on the data cleaning, the data sorting, the understanding of how to construct a network, et cetera. So that's really what the kind of work that we try to facilitate on an ongoing basis. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the questions, additional questions on equity and accessibility that people have asked us to do, but I also wanted to open questions from Zoom or the audience.
Hi, so my name's Doreen. I'm not just referred to me, thank you. Today I was walking up here from my bus stop. I'm a white cane user, and I'm kind of on the high end of partially sighted, so I do routing differently than somebody who's totally blind. But I was thinking about, I'm irritated with one app for a reason, but I was thinking about paths I walk every day that would be safe for a totally blind person, and wondering if there's a way to feed that into data infrastructure somehow, since I have a smartphone, and whether I really am eager to have my location tracked or not, it probably is. So that's just my question of the day. But it's really great to see everybody. It's really great to hear screen reader chatter. It's really great to have students who are willing to answer questions about their posters. So thank you.
Thank
now,
you.
someone else needs to have
So great question. So one of the questions, one of the posters out there was specifically talking about an app that connects to our network, allowing people to comment directly onto the network. One of the challenges that we've had with a lot of the crowdsourcing applications is either they're inaccessible, so it's not easy to comment on something that you can't have access to, or it didn't actually access any real underlying network graph. So you would throw your comment into the ether in a sometimes rather non-specific way. So, you know, I'm not going to name specific crowdsourcing applications, but they may not give you the specificity of like what GPS location is the person commenting on, what is the, you know, specific curb ramp that's the issue. And in this case, we've connected this underlying network graph to the crowdsourcing application that was built. So that's the aim. But in addition to that, there are other ways for people to interact with the data, including like a desktop like dashboard with an editor and things like that. So you can do it at scale, but you can also do it on location. Thanks for that question. I saw another question back there.
Hi, my name is Belen. I heard, and I wanted to make sure I did not miss, but you mentioned that the data is going to be available this summer and to be open to community members. Will there be a cost to this resource, and will the training be available to also utilize the resource?
Thank you for the question. So the data is open right now. You can access it right now through the API. It is absolutely free. What I mentioned about the summer is the training available to community members to teach you how to access that API, how to use the tools so that you'd be able to do those kinds of analyses on your own. Thank you for that question, Belen. Anybody else?
I guess a follow-up question would be like, how would you register or share that information so community members?
Yes, thank you. Sorry. So We have, if you go to the Go Access Map, so tinyurl.com/Go Access Map, and sign up. And in the comment, you can say that you're specifically interested in the training, then that would be great. That also enters you into today's raffle. So 2 in 1.
Follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
In addition to general costuming, you mentioned there's high schoolers and other folks doing these things right now.
Yeah.
If one was aware of additional high school communities in the broader Puget Sound region, what is the best way for young people to continue to get involved? Is it this community element? Are there other programs? How should they connect if they are interested?
Students. So we've been running since 2019 a separate program for AI for All, and that specifically is where those students came from. So it's essentially teaching responsible AI for urban spaces, and that's really all we do. So if you go to aiforall.uw.edu, yes. No, aiforall.cs.uw.edu. And we are now in our 5th year. And Cole Anderson over there in the Telerobot is our co-instructor, right behind, right there. Yeah.
You also have a question in the chat that says, what's the validate of the data?
So, I mean, it's a good question, so I may as well answer it. So all of the data that's currently published has been either manually validated or through AccessMap. Just people using the app allows them to comment back if the data infrastructure does not have integrity. But everything was collected. Everything that's currently published has been manually vetted. That said, we're working with USDOT, and they want us to do 6 counties. And we recently got the Washington State Legislature provided a proviso to collect all sidewalks in the state of Washington. And so the initial foray into that, like the next 2 years, we'll be publishing data that's collected at scale using machine learning and AI, and only sporadically validated manually, because we just can't do manual validation on absolutely everything. But it will be really clear, like, what was fully manually vetted versus the work that's sporadically vetted. Great questions. Awesome. All right. So, without a whole lot of, we have 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go into all the questions that we've had recently. I do want to tell people that for the proviso work, we are working with Washington State DOT as well as local communities to do more in-depth data collections for specific local communities, but we're really looking for local people who want to take lead or take charge of the local data collection. So for instance, if you or someone you know is a local leader or wants to be and wants to work with Front-End Centered and Disability Rights Washington to kind of promote the work of data collection, then please do let me know. And the way to get in touch with me, this is a little bit more ad hoc. We don't have a program necessarily set up for this, but just email uwtcat@uw.edu. And the purpose there is to do a really focused, manually vetted collection of the data so that we can propose ways to do this at scale in the next several years. Cool. All right, so before I let people go, so you saw some of the equity analyses that were taking place out there. Just for those on Zoom, I'll summarize some of the work that was going on out there. So one of the posters was addressing how to redistribute parking spots that are designated for disability parking so that we can get maximal coverage of reach from those locations. So we identified some places where there may not be coverage, and so we can reallocate those spaces potentially in order to address that question. Another question was about how much money would it take to make the walk shed for a particular sound transit station accessible. And so looking at some of Seattle's 2017 data set of sidewalk observations of where the surface may not have full integrity, and being able to kind of price that and identify using the Walkshed's tools, but also the data that was collected through Seattle DOT in combination to be able to address like what is the cost to improve reachability for these sound transit stations. And there was another piece of work on how to collect indoor pathways and station information. Also, first trying to do the crowdsourcing part, but also providing tooling for people to do this at greater scale. So the last thing we wanted to demo here today before you drop off, because on Zoom we won't be able to televise our town hall meeting with Dragomir Anguelov from Waymo. So I'm just going to do a quick demo of Access Map for those of you out there in the ether. And then we'll say goodbye to you until 2 p.m. Sorry about that. And if you do find this interesting and intriguing, if you want to join our pilot, please sign up at tinyurl.com. Go Access Map right there. And is Zoom World able to see Access Map? Yep. So Access Map uses the same exact APIs that you saw those posters are using. Like everything that we're trying to do is creating downstream interoperability. So everybody can grab the data and make different uses of it. So somebody does an equity analysis, somebody does an accessibility analysis, and somebody creates a trip planner, but all of that data underlying it is shared and interoperable. And so this is Access Map. First, let's talk about a little bit about the visual metaphors here. So typically you look at a map and what you see is the roadways, but we are trying to demote the primacy of roadways and elevate the primacy of sidewalk infrastructure because we're talking about people rolling and walking. So you see that the sidewalk infrastructure is shown. You see it in different colors that we've changed the color scheme to make it more accessible to people with color blindness. And what you're going to note here is that different segments might have dotted red lines, which mean that to my personalized mobility profile, this particular segment of the sidewalk may not be accessible. And for some, you can often click on the actual element itself. It will tell you which road side it's associated with. So this is the north sidewalk of North 90th Street. It has an incline of 9.3%, and it's made out of concrete. And what I can say is that it's red dotted line because I indicated on my personal mobility profile that my maximum uphill steepness is 8%. I might be changing that because I can maybe feel like I can do 9.5% today, and then the sidewalk color changes. So the map is not static. It's dynamic, and it changes based on my usability and user profile of how I'm going to use that environment. And I think that's really important about maps, right? Like maps, we're often conceptualizing them as really static elements of the way, but if we're talking about trips, if we're talking about access and commuting and taking transit, it's all dependent on the user, right? So being able to or condition what we see in the map on who's using it and why they're using it may actually give us a much bigger, fuller picture of what's going on. Okay, so the color indicates where it is on the scale of what's accessible to me. So as I changed my preferences, I also changed the color scale here. And what else I can show you is that there are also different visual modes for crossings. So like in the other case, we do have red dotted line crossings. This is one example. Let's see. So this is the crossing at Linden Avenue North. It tells me that there are no curb ramps here, which is actually why it ended up being red dotted line, because my personal profile says that I would like to avoid raised curbs and stairs. If I change that, then it becomes visually inspectable that actually it is accessible to me. But I'll turn this right back. And another mode, which is not shown here, are those crossings that don't have just outlines, but actually are filled in. And that indicates that it's not just having no curb ramps, but it's also marked. So if we know that it is marked, we will color it in. At this point, we don't have APS information in Seattle fully, so we don't expose it. But as soon as we're finishing that data set, we'll have it up there. Okay, so let's do a tiny bit of routing, and then we're going to change gears here. So let's assume I'm going to start from Speedy Glass, and I'm going to route from there, and I'm going to head over to have a nice time at the park. All right. So the router, using my personal mobility profile, which I indicated here, tells me to take a slightly longer route. It's not necessarily what the big map routers might tell me to do, which is likely the straight way across. But you can tell here that there are a few potential issues along the way, which I didn't want to hit. And so the router, the trip planner tells me to go, one block extra in order to get there. You can see that if I change my preferences, it will also change the route. So if I'm telling it that, okay, maybe I can negotiate the non-curb ramp situation, then I can get a shorter route. But at least this way I know what's accessible to me, and I'm not going to take this straight route and fail and have to go around. So another thing about the trip information is that it gives you elevation changes, so you know how far you're going to have to go up, what the total distance is, and it makes some assumptions based on the mobility profiles about how long it might take to get there. And lastly, what we wanted to show today is really the multimodality that we've added. So if I use the polyclinic at Northgate when I finally go to the doctor, and that's right here on 100th Street. Yeah. So the King County Metro bus typically drops me off right there. So I'm going to route from here. And let's say after I finish up, I want to go get some dim sum in International District, because that will make my day nicer. Oops. Okay. I guess I can go back to UW. It's kind of forcing me to do that, so sure. Why not? I'll go back to my office right here. All right. So what you see it just did is it took me from the street environment and leads me through, and I can take the step-by-step instructions, and it tells me really specific segment-by-segment information about the sidewalk information, like continue straight, use the sidewalk, which is the north sidewalk of Northeast 100th Street. We have additional information about proximity to other items along the way if they're available. And finally, it gives me information about how to use the paths in indoor stations. So it leads me right into the Northgate Sound Transit Station. It tells me that I'm entering the station. Visually, there's a demarcation of a different color, that now the indoor environment is a different setup. It tells me exactly like where to go, step by step, how to use the elevator. I should show you that you'll get a different route if you have the settings to know where stairs are not a barrier, in which case, if I go back to the directions and back into the instructions inside the station, you see that now it just leads me through the use of escalators as opposed to elevators in the station. And so going through it, I'm going through the station, I'm going to get to, for those of you who know, Northgate Station, there are 3 levels there, so it leads me all the way up to the 3rd level, tells me to continue straight and use the walkway and board and use the Sound Transit rail. And then you pop out at the University Station and exits the station. You'll see a couple of things here as well, but Kunal will speak about this a lot more later downstream. This is primarily for people with vision disabilities. The cards will speak for you as you go through the path. So now I'm doing a preview of the path because I'm here with you today. But if I was actually to be traveling and taking this route, the screen reader will be able to update based on your location and speak the information to you. And then it will say you will pass by a train station building on your left called University of Washington and a bench on your right in 1.2 meters. So it gives you orientation information that's pretty specific about what you're facing as you travel. And I think with that, it will then lead me to my office. Or did I just kill the trip? No, I got it. Yeah.
Pamela from WashDOT asks, does the tool account for mid-block crossing conditions?
If there is a mid-block crossing allowable, yes, but it has to be marked and actually demarcated there. But yes, we collect that as well. Thank you for the question.